a man who is a true leader, a very wise man, and because I know him, a very holy man. And so I have to tell you what a great bit of pride it is for me to have such a dear friend here in our diocese in what may well be his first public appearance outside of his own archdiocese since he's been made a cardinal. So I'd like you all to welcome Cardinal Trinity.
The Long Island primaries? Bishop Murphy, thanks. You could have gone on forever speaking. As often he does, right? Well, everybody, it's an honor and a joy to be with you this morning. Thank you. Thank you very much for your very gracious invitation and this extraordinarily warm welcome. I was riding rather high until somebody said to me on the way in, after I thanked him for being here, he said, well, it's Lent, and we figured it would be good to come listen to you. Am I turned into an act of penance or what? On second thought, I've compared Lent to our spiritual spring training, when we follow the example of the New York Yankees and even the New York Mets, and use these intense 40 days of preparation for Easter to get back to the basics of discipleship. And our political duties that you've asked me to speak on today would certainly be one of those essentials of Christian discipleship, our own Catholic witness in the public square, which you thoughtfully invited me to address today. I did want to make a reference to the New York Mets and the New York Yankees. I've become a Yankee fan. I hope you know that, Bishop Murphy. When I got here, somebody said, are you going to be a Met fan or a Yankee fan? And I said, well, in this instance, I think I can be pro-choice. I feel bad for the Mets, though, don't you? I hope you have a root for the underdog in Catholic social justice, as I'm going to mention in a little while. I've been invited to do the opening pitch for the New York Yankees, and when they called to the... When I saw Mr. Wilpon of the New York Mets, I said, you're going to invite me to do the opening pitch? He said, actually, I wish you'd come and administer the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. I thought it was kind of telling that the Mets had their spring training in Lourdes. Now, I know my credentials of loyalty to the New York Yankees are impeccable, all right? You know, one of the things, I'm not that rebellious, especially when it comes to Rome, but one of the things I would not do at the consistory is wear red socks. You know, there's another team up north that boasts of the Red Sox, and I do not support them. But Bishop Murphy, you can have these. All right, I do have, if I could start with just two reservations. First of all, I'm speaking in general, lifting up our voices, how Catholics can make an impact on public policy. It was only in listening to the news this morning when I was shaving that I found out that I was supposed to be, that now it's been touted as speaking on the HHS mandates. Not true. I've been invited to speak on how Catholics can make an impact in public policy, but you can bet what I'm going to say will have an impact, and I will refer to it during the talk. And secondly, in all sincerity, if you wanted an expert to speak on the public witness that we give in the square, in the public square, if you wanted an expert to speak on Catholic social justice, you didn't have to go out of the diocese, because your own bishop is one of the more internationally acclaimed experts in this area. And Bishop Murphy, I thank you for the leadership that you've given. Lifting Lifting up our voices, how Catholics can make an impact in public policy. You ready? Here's what I thought I'd do. What do you say we take about a 45-minute walk from the is to the ought? That's classic Catholic morality, by the way. We accept an is, something that's kind of given, and then we find out that this is has an ought, a moral implication attached. So what I'm first going to do is give 7 ises, 7 givens of Catholic social justice, our principles. By the way, that's the title, that's the handle we usually give all of this, Catholic social justice. The duties that we have as disciples of Jesus Christ to bring our values outside of us. That's usually called Catholic social justice. So I'll spend a while giving 7 ises of Catholic social justice principles, and then I'll get down to some of the oughts, okay? Kind of the practical implications of it. By the way, I can only begin to scratch the surface. I'm hoping, and something tells me it's probably available today, that you'll take a chance to read Faithful Citizenship, the document that comes out from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops periodically. We try to revise it usually a year before the election, just to offer some principles to guide us in our public witness. And that you'd also read, probably the best thing offered, the compendium of the Catechism on Social Justice, put out by Rome, which Bishop Murphy had a big hand in the authorship of that. Those are the two excellent resources you shouldn't pass up. All right, let's look at the 7 ises, okay? Number 1, the innate dignity of the human person. The innate dignity of the human person. That is as first a principle of Catholic social justice as is the first book of the Bible, that reveals to us that every human person is made in the image and likeness of God. Every human being is God's work of art, a very reflection of God, who carries within him or her the very spark of God's life, who is loved personally and passionately by a Creator who is destined, that human person, to spend eternity with him in heaven. Blessed Mother Teresa of Calcutta, remember when Malcolm Muggeridge was tailing her to write his book that would become something beautiful for God. Prior to Malcolm Muggeridge's own conversion to Christianity and Catholicism, one day in exasperation, after watching her hug these maggot-covered, pus-covered, bleeding, with vomit and excrement all over, hugging these people, finally said, Mother Teresa, how do you do it? How do you hug and kiss these people? And she said, because when I look at them, I see the face of Jesus, the spark of the divine, the reflection of God that is in every single human being. There's the first is, okay? And you can already see in your minds how this is going to have a tremendous ought in our political witness. Number 2, the second is, human life itself is thus unquestionably sacred. From the moment of conception to the moment of natural death, human life thus deserves unquestioned respect and protection. Human life can never become a means to an end. Human life is always an end in itself. Irenaeus, one of the early fathers of the church, says, the glory of God is man fully alive. Human life is sacred. Is number 3, everybody, the principle of solidarity. Solidarity. John Paul II made this a kitchen table word. But this principle, even though perhaps not with that vocabulary, this principle of solidarity has been a constant of Catholic social justice for centuries. What's it mean, this solidarity? Well, what it means is we look around creation, as we look at the communities we live in, we conclude, hey, we are all in this mess together. Thus, we're called not only to serve and protect our own dignity and our own lives, we're called not only to survival, we're called to solidarity, to serve others, to protect their dignity, to cherish and protect their lives. Thus, you see there's an inherent social dimension, a communal aspect to our life here on earth, to promote the common good, to help construct a society of virtue, a culture of life, to help construct a society of virtue and responsibility where human dignity is savored and human life is revered, Boy, that is a very noble vocation. Thus, informed political action is a duty. It's not some tawdry distraction. While it is true, as St. Paul reminds us, that we have our true citizenship in heaven, that here we have no lasting home, that does not absolve us from seeking the common good and working for virtue here on earth. The fourth is, the Creator has instilled within us and in his creation, in the world, in the planet, an inherent ardor, an elementary grammar of right and wrong intended to protect human dignity and human life. There is a basic integrity, a coherence, an ardor to creation and to the creature that is disregarded at our peril. This, what we call natural law, is not Jewish, it's not Christian, it's not Catholic, it's not Hindu, it's not Buddhist, it's not Islamic. It is natural, it is human. It is available to everybody by reason and discoverable by reflection and long experience based on common sense. It is hardwired into us and part of our moral DNA. A just and virtuous civil society will then, yes, be regarded by human laws, but these must always flow from and never contradict the natural law. Policy and politics can never trump principle. That's an is, a given in our social justice. From this, by the way, is developing a new approach that we call stewardship. And I'm not here talking about financial stewardship, which we bishops love to talk about, and which in a way does flow from this. I'm talking about more stewardship of the person and stewardship of the environment and creation as we recognize the inherent coherence and integrity placed within by God, and that we're called upon to respect that, all right? Is number 5, subsidiarity. Subsidiarity. The common good is best served, so this principle would say, by agencies, organisms, and institutions closest to the human person. The smaller, the better. The primary of those is marriage and family. But then would come such things as neighborhood, church, small community, voluntary associations, and then on up through such things as business, government, and state. Men and women, this is would tell us, work best when governing and community organizations are closest to them. Yes, small is beautiful, the principle of subsidiarity would say. It takes a village, to borrow somebody else's phrase. Or, as the good friend of Bishop Murphy, Tip O'Neill, said, all politics is local. That's subsidiarity, see? Is number 6. Sometimes it's called the preferential option for the poor. Sometimes it's called care for those left behind. I prefer the model of Jesus, who always seemed to have radar for those at the side of the road, whether it be the blind beggar, or the leper, or the mother worried about her daughter, or the grieving widow. Those struggling, those left behind, those at the side of the road, they have a particular priority in our social justice outlook. The Bible, especially the Hebrew scriptures, will often use the terms the orphan, the widow, and the alien to sum up those who stand in special need because they really have nobody else to help. So in this is our responsibility, especially to the poor and those in need. Responsibility trumps rights, and we are never freed from the duty to serve others, particularly those in need. And is number 7, everybody. Because of the innate dignity of the human person, because of the sanctity of human life, every person has certain inalienable rights. You've heard that before. Given, not by society, not by culture, not by government, but by the Creator himself. rights instilled by God in the very makeup of the human person, which must be cherished and guarded by others, by society and government itself. Highest among these, this is would say, would be freedom of religion, because all other rights come from this belief that there's someone outside of us who is giving us those other rights. Freedom of religion, but also the freedom to live securely with basic human dignity respected and preserved by the society in which we live. At the core of civil society, then, is not only charity, which, as the Holy Father reminds us, is the love and care freely and sacrificially rendered to others. Bravo for that. But not just charity, but at the core of a civil society is justice. Justice, that's love and service required as a duty by a civil society. Now, I've tried my best to summarize for you these 7 is's. There are more, and I don't know if I did a good job of summarizing all of them. But what I'd like to do now is investigate for a little while the oughts, the moral oughts that flow from these 7 is's. And I'll have 7 oughts as well, all right? So here we go. Ought number 1. We ought to be in politics, all right? We might be gathering here in Hicksville, but we ain't political hicks, okay? We are called to be very active, very informed, and very involved in politics. Catholic tradition builds upon people like Plato and Aristotle in believing that politics is noble, all right? It is a noble call. We're not like the Amish. I love the Amish, by the way, and we can sure learn a lot about them. But they would have a view, admirable that it is, and certainly justified by the Bible, that Christians are best living off by themselves, all right? Somewhat isolated from others. That has never been part of our Catholic tradition. We prefer to accent the words of Jesus that we are called to be lights to the world and salt to the earth, bringing our values radiantly to the public square. No, we're no longer in the catacombs, we're on the street corners. And for us, an informed, enlightened politics is a duty of Christian discipleship and Catholic life. Patriotism is a virtue exhibited not only on the battlefield. Sometimes, I think you would agree with me, and we're like other Americans, sometimes we get frustrated with politics. Sometimes we prefer to leave it to others. Sometimes we'll say, I'm sick of the whole bunch of them and want to retreat. That, of course, is not good, all right? That, of course, leaves a vacuum that others are more than happy to fill. Bishop Murphy will know what I'm talking about. In 1870, for those of you familiar with church history, it was a tough time for the church in Europe. Pope Pius IX had just lost the Papal States. You remember that for a good chunk of history, the Pope was not only a spiritual leader of the church, but he was the political leader of a good chunk of Italy. And the forces of the Italian Risorgimento to unite Italy whittled it down until in 1870, when Rome was under attack. That's when the Pope retreated to the Vatican and became this self-imposed prisoner of the Vatican. Now, needless to say, Pius IX was not happy. And he certainly wasn't allied to the forces of Italian politics that led him to do this. So he issued what was called his non-expedit, which was the Latin word to Italian Catholics saying, don't get involved in politics. They are our enemies. They don't like us. They're out to get us. Don't get involved in politics. And loyal Catholics obeyed him, and disaster happened. Because until Pope St. Pius X rescinded that, about 40 years later, the voice of the informed Catholic in the public square was mute in Italy. And of course, those of you familiar with politics in Italy know that we suffer from that today. That's why politics in the Italian Republic to this day have somewhat of an anti-church bent, because in the normative years, the voice of an informed, enlightened Catholic laity was muted. We don't want to go there, folks, and there's a lot of people who tempt us to. We can be political without being partisan. If we're not in politics, believe me, another religion will be, the religion called secularism. That religion too has a creed. That religion too has dogma. That religion too has a lot of adherents. And one of their doctrines is that we, our religion, should not be involved in the public square. They'll be happy to take it over for us, and we can't let that happen. Final point in this number one is that we ought to be in politics. And I'm preaching to the choir here. To be actively involved in politics is the particular charism of the laity. This is the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, Lumen Gentium and Gaudium et Spes. This was even made more explicit in that providential encyclical of Blessed John Paul II, Christi Fidelis Laici, addressed to the lay faithful of the Church. You lay people have this specific charism of bringing a religiously informed political consciousness into the public square. We bishops and we priests don't. We stick to principles, all right? We leave a lot of the messiness of politics up to you. Now, I say that in some ways, everybody, out of self-defense, because it seems to me that a lot of Catholic folks don't get that. They still come running to Daddy, namely to me and Bishop Murphy, to say, why don't you bishops do something? Why don't you excommunicate so-and-so? Why don't you throw these people out of the church? Why don't you say that this is a mortal sin? In other words, they will want us to do the dirty work of politics. Now, as Bishop Nicholas DiMarzio, our brother in Brooklyn, who perhaps says things a bit more bluntly than Bishop Murphy and I do, he has responded to them, get off it. You're the ones who vote. You're the ones who can run for office. You're the ones who can write your representatives. You're the ones who can get into political organization, so do it. We'll preach the principles, but the charism of political involvement that belongs particularly to the laity. Remember, by the way, Bishop Murphy was Father Descos. I always get Cardinal or Descoto in Nicaragua. Remember when John Paul II castigated him? Was it Descoto? Cardinal? Cardinal. Remember that famous episode in 1980 when John Paul II visited Nicaragua? Remember the Sandinistas were in control. They were kind of a far-left leading, perhaps Marxist government. Yeah. And remember there was a priest who held a cabinet position. And do you remember the famous scene when the government cabinet was lined up to greet the Holy Father, when he came to Father Cardinal, who was a minister in the Sandinista government, and Father Cardinal knelt down to kiss his ring and began to get up, and John Paul kept him down and began to castigate him, all right? Saying, you should not hold this political position. Now that was widely interpreted as John Paul being against the Sandinistas. No, he was saying the same thing to priests back in Poland. A priest's job is not to become involved in explicitly partisan politics. Our job, bishops and priests and deacons, is to preach the principles which will guide our lay people in doing that for us. We preach principle, not about political candidates or partisanship. Ought number two. The first one, we ought to be in politics. Number two, we ought to bring values and convictions to politics. We will not be misled by those who say, and Lord knows their number is legion and their voice is strong, that religiously informed voices have no place in the public square. You remember the legendary Father Richard John Newhouse, before he had become a Catholic or a priest, as a prominent Lutheran minister. He wrote a book now almost 30 years old, but as timely as ever, called The Naked Public Square. Remember? I think it was back in 1982. Wherein he said that American politics are impoverished when the voices of religiously and faith-formed consciences and voices are absent from the public square. Unless faithful citizens have a voice at the table of political discourse, our republic itself suffers, Father Newhouse would say. We have a duty, folks, not so much as Catholics, but as loyal American citizens, to bring faith-inspired conviction to politics. You know, American historians, and that happens to be what I took my doctorate in, American historians will say that every noble movement in American history has been religiously inspired. Winthrop Hudson, for instance, the great American historian, will say that the American Revolution itself, the Revolutionary War, and the drive for independence from England was inspired by the great religious reawakenings. The abolitionist movement, to do away with the scar, the wound of slavery, religiously inspired. The Civil War and the addresses of Lincoln himself are shot through with references to religion. The temperance movement against alcohol. Needless to say, that wasn't quite one that we Catholics were involved in, all right? But a strong movement it was in American history, religiously, evangelically inspired. The progressive movement that brought about so many things that now we take for granted and rejoice in as American citizens, inspired by the religious convictions of people like William Jennings Bryan. Woodrow Wilson, a devout Presbyterian, inspired his drive for international peace. The Union movement, the Civil Rights movement, the peace movement of the 60s, and today the premier civil rights movement in our society, the pro-life movement, are all religiously inspired, you see? So if we don't bring our religious convictions into the public square, it's not only we Catholics and Christians and believers that suffer, it's the American Republic itself. Because the separation of church and state, which, as you know, is not a term found in the Constitution, does not mean separation of religion and morality from politics. And this, of course, renders as completely preposterous those who would say, I am a believer, I am a man or a woman of high moral conviction formed by my faith, so I am personally opposed to some things, but I cannot impose that on others. That dichotomy, that cleavage, is artificial and flies not only in the face of Catholic social justice, but in the genius and the wisdom of the American Republic. Third ought. Catholics ought to propose, never impose. You got that? Now, this is important, folks, because we Catholics are always lambasted, and we bishops especially, as seeking to impose peculiar Catholic doctrine and morals upon the rest of the country. That, of course, is baloney. If we were lobbying for a law to outlaw hot dogs on the Fridays of Lent, if we were lobbying for laws that would require mass attendance on Sunday, then somebody could legitimately say, you Catholics are trying to impose your peculiar beliefs on others, and that's not right, and that's not American, and I'd agree with them wholeheartedly. All those ises, those 7 ises with which I began my presentation, they're principles that don't flow from religion, our faith, or the Catholic Church, or the Vatican, or bishops. No, they are human principles flowing from the inherent makeup of the creature and creation from natural law. So we will always deny that the church is in the business of trying to impose its doctrine. Now, of course, this comes up today in the timely issue at hand. So you will hear our enemies say the bishops of the United States are trying to impose upon the rest of the country their peculiar morality about contraception because they've lost the argument even for their own people. I ask, who's trying to impose what on who? We're not trying to impose our teaching on anybody. We're simply saying, don't impose your teaching upon us and make us do as a church what we find unconscionable to do. So the imposition more often than not, the imposition doesn't come from us. More often than not, we just want to be left alone to do our work, okay? We don't seek any privileges. We don't seek any prerogatives. We've learned the hard way that in the long run the church suffers, any church, any religion, when it is given a privileged position in society. We don't want that. We love the American experiment of the separation of church and state, as long as we know that flows from the number one freedom, the freedom of religion, which, by the way, is not limited just to freedom of worship, all right? China has freedom of worship. Chinese people, theoretically, can go to any church they want. We do know, of course, in practice they're harassed, but theoretically there's freedom of worship. There's not freedom of religion. What's the difference? Freedom of worship says you can go for an hour on Sunday morning or Saturday or Friday, whatever your Sabbath might do. That's fine. No questions asked. Just don't let that faith have any impact on what you do the rest of the week, particularly in your political judgments. The United States is based not just on freedom of worship, but on freedom of religion. And most of the time, the imposition doesn't come from us. It comes from those who are opposed to us. Ought number 4. We ought to stand for principle always above politics. Principle above politics. You know, Arthur Schlesinger, a case can be made, perhaps one of our greatest American historians, he writes that the normative documents in our beloved country, whether it be the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, certainly the Constitution, could have been the most enlightened documents ever, based firmly on the tradition of and principles of human rights and natural law, except. Pragmatism trumped principle, and they gave in on the issue of slavery, which tainted those documents and which caught up with us 80 years later. President Eisenhower, when he was advised to nuke Korea, when he first entered the White House in 1953, his military advisor said, "General, it'd be pragmatic, it'd be popular, it'd be practical." President Eisenhower said, "You're probably right, but it would hardly be principled." Principle trumps pragmatism. Now, politics is the art of the possible, meaning that compromise and strategy is called for. And we're into that. We're certainly for compromise, as long as we're not asked to compromise on principle. Blessed John Paul II made this very clear in his epic encyclical, The Gospel of Life, Evangelium Vitae. Remember when he asked the theoretical question, if somebody is called upon to support a piece of pro-life legislation that might not be everything we want, but which at least makes a step in the right direction, can we support it? Or do we have to say, we're not going to support it until we get absolutely everything we want? John Paul II said, it is completely morally licit to accept half a loaf rather than the full. So we are shrewd. We're realistic, all right? We do know that compromise and strategy is important as long as we don't sacrifice our principles. We bishops just did that, by the way. Bishop Murphy knows so well in our dealings with Albany when it comes to assistance for our schools, which we feel is a right injustice. The governor and the legislator took a first step when they gave us some of the mandated service and the cap, wasn't it, Bishop Murphy? We didn't get cap yet. We got the mandated services. We didn't get the cap yet. We certainly didn't get vouchers yet. We didn't get more extensive. Now, some would say, bishops, don't take it. Say, forget it. We're not going to take anything until you give us everything. Well, we're not that stupid, okay? There is a prudential judgment that is allowed sometime that will allow us to accept half a loaf while we keep working for the full loaf. So, prudential judgment is good. Pragmatism isn't bad. Compromise is called for. Realism can be a virtue as long as it doesn't violate principle. Ought number 5. We ought to stress responsibility as much as rights. Boy, I'm not telling you, we live in an era of entitlement where everybody seems to think that government exists to satisfy our urges, and by the way, to pay for them. We've gone completely opposite, as the words of John Kennedy on January 20th, 1961. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. We've sure turned that on its head, as now we ask what entitlements, what rights the government can give us and pay for. So we seem to have a right du jour, new rights every day. Last spring and summer we heard about a right to marry. I thought there was a vocation to marriage, there was a call to marriage, there was a responsible entering into marriage. I don't recall a right to marriage. Now we hear there's a right to sterilization, abortion, and chemical contraceptives. I suppose we could say that there might be some doctor who would say to a man who's suffering some type of sexual dysfunction, you ought to start visiting a prostitute to help you, and I will write a prescription, and I would hope the government would pay for it. Would there be a right to a sex change operation that insurance and government would pay for? We live in an era that seems to discover new rights every day and then expect the government and culture and society to pay for it. The church emphasizes responsibility more than rights. Oh, we're into rights big time, as I'm going to mention in a second. The church, if you've noticed, is very much a via media between rights and responsibilities. For us, it's a both and, not an either or proposition. Let me give you a couple examples. Back in the 1890s, there was great debates about the two extremes of unfettered capitalism and socialism or communism, which was right. And Pope Leo XIII, in his providential encyclical Rerum Novarum, he took the via media. He took the middle road. He said, from capitalism, we can learn the value of freedom and marketplace and a good job and the self-worth that comes from productive labor. From socialism, we can learn the value of taking care of each other and the government making sure that rights are protected. So we need some of both, you see. There's that via media, that prudent mid-road between rights and responsibilities. Another one would be in immigration. That's a very neuralgic one today, is it not? So once again, the church usually is right smack dab in the middle. We would say, yes, the government has the right to secure borders and to be vigilant about immigrants. But darn it, there's also a basic right of a human being to seek betterment, to seek a life of peace and security and tranquility and freedoms. And there's a right of a family to be united and not to be split up. Those are two rights that the church would say must be balanced in a via media, a both and, not an either or. We're neither libertarians nor big government socialists. Catholic social justice is usually right in the middle. Number 6, our 6th ought. We ought to defend the rights of others, whether that be the fragile baby in the womb, whether that be those dying, whether that be the refugee and immigrant, whether that be the starving and persecuted and war-torn throughout the world. Part of our political oughtness is always to defend the rights of those where their rights are being threatened. The premier right, as I mentioned earlier, is that of religion. Not a freedom of worship, but a freedom of religion. That, of course, is what the HHS fight is all about. It is a freedom of religion battle. It is not about contraception. It's not about women's health. By the way, we Catholics hardly need to be lectured about women's health. Thanks mostly to the sisters, our religious sisters, we happen to run the best private health care for women and children in our country. Bishop Murphy and I heard a report earlier this week from Fidelis, which is owned by the Catholic Church in the state of New York, the largest provider of insurance for struggling people, Medicare and Medicaid people in the state, that gets the highest ratings of any other private insurance program when it comes to the care of women and children. So we don't need to be lectured about that. This is a religious freedom question, all right? Of the government's intrusion upon the integrity of a church to decide what it can teach, by whom who will be commissioned as ministers, and what ministry we shall provide. A doctor, for instance, might prescribe red wine to help the flow of the blood. I sure wish mine would, all right? That doesn't mean that a Baptist church would have to pay for it, right? The law of the land allows us to carry guns. That doesn't mean that a Quaker would be forced to carry one. No, we're talking about an unwarranted, unprecedented, radical intrusion into the interior life of integrity of a church's ability to teach, serve, and sanctify on its own. President Lyndon Baines Johnson was asked once to support a bill that would have affected the Catholic Church and that we would have found unconscionable, somewhat similar to what we're dealing with now. And President Johnson said, as an American, he said, I look to the churches, I look to religion like a beehive. If you leave them alone, they're going to give you tons of good honey. But if you stick your hand in them, you're going to get stung bad. Not a bad analogy. Flowing from this defense of rights, everybody, would be, and I think, and I say a mea culpa for us bishops as well, we need to be much more assertive in our social justice responsibility and our informed actions, especially in defending the freedom of religion abroad. Do you realize now, at this moment, how many people, just because they might happen to be Jewish or Christian, are literally in the crosshairs of a terrorist simply because of their religion? All right? And do you realize how many believers throughout the world are being harassed and persecuted and, yes, even martyred simply because of their religion? In this country, we're worried, but boy, do we praise God for the religious freedom that we have. And it is a moral imperative for us to become much more sensitive about the religious freedom of those outside our beloved country. All right? And number 7, the last ought. In our political witness, in our social justice, we Catholics ought to stress us, not just me. Politics, in our mind, is about the common good, not just the individual good. Politics is about solidarity, the improvement and service of community. We're also called to take the high road when it comes to political discourse: civility, honesty, virtue, dialogue rather than threats. We're not so much cultural warriors as we are engaged in involved in robust engagement. We prefer the positive to the negative. I know he's maligned a lot, but in a recent biography I was reading of Richard Nixon in the 1960 election, which you know was so close. Richard Nixon's political advisors at the last moment said, Senator Nixon, Vice President Nixon, if you would simply hint at John Kennedy's religion, if you would simply bring it up, we're told, and we have the data, that we could throw enough votes that you would win. And to his credit, President Nixon said no. In that matter, at least, he took the high road. Or do you remember something as simple as Walter Mondale in 1984 when they were preparing for the debates? And his advisor said, we want you to the right of President Reagan because it's that ear that is bad. And you'll be able to embarrass him because he won't be able to hear you well. And Mondale said, not at all. I'll go to the other side. Simple, yet the high road, civility, tragically missing, I would propose, in today's politics. And of course, in this matter, when we're concerned about the us and not just the me, comes once again that preferential option for the poor. 2 weeks ago this day, everybody, I had the honor of receiving the red hat from the Pope, all right? It was a great day for me. That Saturday, February 23rd, I think it was. And that night was a great night. I had a whole day of celebrations. And that very night, all the new cardinals, 22 of us, were invited by the Vatican Museum that all of our visitors could spend the evening by themselves in the Vatican Museum in the Sistine Chapel. That was a great boost. You know, that's usually there's 100,000 people there, and all the cardinals together maybe had 6,000 or 7,000 people. We had it all to ourselves. Now, I didn't go on the tour of the museum. I had been there enough, but the guide said to me, Cardinal, if I will arrange for your group from New York to be all by themselves, we had about 800 of them, in the Sistine Chapel, just by themselves at 7:30. Why don't you come and address them? So I did. 7:30, folks, all right? There I am. I'm in my brand new scarlet cassock. I got my red beretta on. I am feeling on top of the world. The Swiss guards throw open the Sistine Chapel. It is filled with 800 of my people who did not know I was coming. They began to cheer. The flash bulbs went off. I am strutting up the aisle of the Sistine Chapel. And I get to the top where I was going to lead them in prayer and speak a little bit about the chapel. I am so full of myself. I get to the top and I look up and what do I see but Michelangelo's Last Judgment. You talk about sobering. You talk about cold water in the face. I'm looking at it and I'm saying, Dolan, when you stand before the judgment seat of Christ our King, I know what he's going to ask you, because he told us in Matthew's Gospel. He's not going to call me, like my mom does, Your Eminence, all right? Odds are I'm not going to be wearing this scarlet robe. Odds are I'm going to be kind of wearing what he gave me on the day of my birth, all right? He's not going to kiss my ring, all right? What he is going to say is, Dolan, did you feed the hungry? Did you care for the poor? Did you teach the kids? Did you defend the babies? Did you heal the sick? Did you visit those in prison? Did you take care of the least of my brothers? Because when you do, you're taking care of me. That has to animate all of our political social justice. And that is a good place to end. Let me end by recalling that one word again, solidarity. Solidarity. We are not alone. And let me bring you back in time 33 years. To the days, to June of 1979, to the days that are now called the 9 days that changed the world, to the event that Henry Kissinger says will rank up in the storming of the Bastille, which began the French Revolution in 1789, namely John Paul II's visit to Poland. Now, when John Paul II went to Poland in 1979, you search the speeches, he said nothing partisan. He probably didn't say anything overtly political as much as a hyper-criticism of the regime. He stuck to the high road. He spoke about principles. He spoke about faith. He called upon the noble destiny of the Polish people. And the Polish people gradually raised their head, a head that had been crushed, whether it be by Prussians or by Nazis or by Stalinists, a head that had been crushed, a people that had been told they didn't have a name, they were a number, a people who were told that their culture and ideals were laughable, a people that were told that they were inferior and an oppression. And for 9 days he spoke to them, and gradually the Polish people began to raise their head, and they looked around and they saw millions of others. Millions of others. The beautiful story of the man in the village who said, I'm not going to the Pope's Mass. The troops will have the fire hoses out. My name will be taken. Nothing will happen. And he sat and he just heard the people walking. Footstep after footstep. Hundreds, thousands, millions, until finally he joined them. The people of Poland raised their head as solidarity took hold. And in that marvelous moment in Warsaw, when in the middle of the Pope's address, they simply began to shout, "We want God. We want God." And he was shrewd enough to let him go, all right? And for 17 minutes, over close to 2 million people, we want God. The recently opened archives from the communist era show that the Polish communist officials telegrammed the Kremlin reporting that incident saying, it's over. It's over. solidarity trumped. Folks, it's about us. We are not alone. We're not a number, all right? We're not anonymous. We look up and see people who share our values and our vision, that we are created in the image and likeness of God, that our freedom and dignity come not from a government who can give it and take it away, but from a God who has given it and wants us to last for all eternity. And in everything that we do, whether it be our social justice or our politics, we with the people of Poland stand up and say, we want God. Thank you for listening.